Your lecturer is Dr. Kenneth J. Hammond, an expert on the cultural and intellectual history of China. Professor Hammond holds graduate degrees in East Asian Regional Studies and East Asian Languages from Harvard University, and he is Professor of History and Director of the Confucius Institute at New Mexico State University. His scholarship has earned him prestigious grants and fellowships from organizations including the American Council of Learned Societies.
Hello, I'm Ken Hammond. I'm Associate Professor of History at New Mexico State University, and I'm going to be doing the lectures on 5,000 years of Chinese history from Yao to Mao, and we'll try to make some sense of what the title means as we go along. Before we begin to deal with the actual course of China's history, I want to take a few moments to suggest some of the general themes that we're going to be engaging with as we go through these lectures. We'll be concerned with how the Chinese have organized their society and government. We'll be concerned with how social elites, ruling groups, have emerged and flourished at different times in Chinese history, what the bases for their power has been, how they've sustained and supported themselves, and how they've legitimated that power, how they've made their rule acceptable to people over time. We're going to be talking about how the Chinese have thought about their own society and how they've seen the world around them. We'll consider the relationship between China and the outside world. First of all, the matter of Chinese civilization itself, how it emerges, the relationship between China as a civilization, as a culture, and the people immediately surrounding it, often seen by the Chinese as barbarians. We'll be talking about how China's been involved in larger regional systems, in the global economy over time. And in later lectures, we'll look at how influences coming into China from the outside world have affected the development of Chinese history and its interaction, the history of China's interaction with that larger world, particularly the modern Western world. We'll explore the connections between economic and social life and the worlds of art and literature and philosophy. Cultural and political life in China have always been linked in ways that are sometimes very different from how we normally think of things in the West. We don't usually have the situation in the West where we have a poet who's also the president. But in Chinese history, the way Chinese culture has worked traditionally, the poets, the painters, the artists were often also the high political officials of a particular time. So we'll be looking at some of the ways that that has worked over time. And then we'll investigate the question of whether developments in China, the development of Chinese history, parallels the history of other parts of the world, or whether it sort of runs along on its own track. We'll see that in some instances there are connections or at least parallels between what develops in China, while in other ways the Chinese experience is unique to itself. Sometimes it seems that China has taken a developmental path quite different from that of the West. But in other ways, I think we can approach the history of China as a set of alternative responses, alternative choices in response to common challenges, common problems that people anywhere in history have faced. Well, in embarking on our exploration of Chinese history, let's begin by establishing just where and what China is and was. China is located in East Asia, and it's defined by several significant geographic features. To the east of China is the Pacific Ocean. China has a long coast on the Pacific, running from fairly far in the north to the tropics in the south. In the south, beyond the area settled by Chinese people, Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, Burma, Thailand. The heartland of China is bounded on the west by mountains, high mountains, the mountains that go up to the Tibetan Plateau, Burma, and also further north by the Gobi Desert, the vast inner expanses of Asia. And then to the north of China are the grasslands of Mongolia, and a little bit sort of northeast, the forests and mountains of what today we call Manchuria. Okay? That's what surrounds China. That's what sort of defines China as what China isn't. What China is, what we refer to historically as China proper, is the core, the area where the Chinese people, in their hundreds of millions today, have always lived. This area we can think of as containing sort of 4 subregions. In the north is the North China Plain, and the North China Plain is a fairly vast expanse of flat, level farmland, relatively easy to travel back and forth across it. Historically, pretty well watered. It used to be a few thousand years ago, even wetter than it is today. There's been a long-term process of sort of drying out that's affected the ecology of the north. But the North China Plain is the agricultural heartland of Chinese civilization. It's where Chinese civilization first begins to historically emerge, and it is still where a huge proportion of the Chinese population is concentrated. South of the North China Plain is a region of hills and valleys, mostly south of the Yangtze River. We'll talk about the rivers in a minute. And this is quite a contrast to the North China Plain, where in North China you can go for days and days on foot or on horseback across open land. In the south, settlements are divided off from one another by these mountains and valleys. The lowlands along the river valleys tend to be where agricultural settlement developed. The highlands, more rugged land, served as barriers between these areas where Chinese populations grew up. Now to the southwest is the Sichuan Basin. And the Sichuan Basin is itself a fairly extensive agricultural plain, but it's cut off all around by high mountains. The major way to get there, its major point of accessibility, is up the Yangtze River through the famous gorges of the Yangtze River. Very beautiful, stark, but also very challenging terrain. Sichuan has been, because of these mountains, has been somewhat isolated from some of the mainstreams of development. Sometimes it's been protected from the chaos and warfare that's plagued other parts of China. In other ways, it has sometimes served as a kind of refuge. We'll see some instances of that as we go along. Finally, in the northwest, there's a large area of highlands, of plateaus and fairly deeply cut river valleys that's very dry, very different from South China or the North China Plain, high and dry in the northwest. Chinese civilization, Chinese culture has been shaped by this landscape, and most particularly by 2 great rivers that flow from west to east. In the north, the Yellow River, which rises on the Tibetan Plateau and then makes this long sort of loop. I tell my students often that on the map it looks sort of like a pilgrim's hat, and that's called the Ordos Loop. And after making that long loop, it then flows east across the North China Plain, reaching the sea on one side or another of the Shandong Peninsula. Over time in history, the mouth of the Yellow River has shifted north, south, back south, many, many times. It's often a major disaster when this happens because of the flooding that's entailed, but it has been a constant source also of renewal for the land in North China as the silt that's brought down from the highlands is deposited during these periods of epic flooding. It's called the Yellow River because it's so full of silt. It carries a lot of dirt as it flows out and slows down across the North China Plain. Controlling the Yellow River, dealing with the flooding, the challenges of hydraulic management has been one of the concerns, one of the institutional problems that Chinese civilization has faced for a very long time. The southern of the 2 great rivers that flows across China is called the Yangtze River, or in Chinese they call it the Changjiang, which just means the Long River. We generally refer to it in English as the Yangtze. It also originates up on the Tibetan Plateau, but it flows down through the Sichuan Basin, through this flat area surrounded by mountains in the southwest, and then out through the narrow gorges of the Yangtze, winding its way through central China, a very wet area, lots of lakes, lots of, again, efforts to control the flooding of the river historically. And then finally makes a long arc through East China and emerges into the Pacific just north of where today the city of Shanghai is located. Now, I mentioned that Chinese civilization, the earliest Chinese cultures, appeared in the north, on the North China Plain, in the valley of the Yellow River. A couple of alternative centers that we'll talk about in the next lecture, down further south in the Yangtze River Valley. But over time, the area that the Chinese people have lived in, the area that Chinese civilization has controlled, has expanded. And areas that were peripheral to the original zone of Chinese civilization have become part of China's territory. This has largely been a process of the expansion of agriculture. Chinese farmers moving south and southwest into the highlands of what are now Guizhou and Yunnan provinces. Tibet, further to the west, up on the very high plateau of Central Asia, has been linked to Chinese civilization since about the 7th century of the present era. And Chinese power has been extended into Central Asia, projected out along the ancient trade route that we call the Silk Road, running off to the northwest and then eventually extending on out to Persia and down to India and eventually even over to the Mediterranean. The Mongolian steppes, which are very different from the agricultural heartland of China, have been linked to Chinese civilization, partly by the fact that tribes out in the grasslands have raided the Chinese frontier historically, and also because from time to time China, particularly strong dynasties in Chinese history, have been able to project Chinese power out into the grasslands and incorporate Mongolia into Chinese control. Finally, in the northeast, what today we call Manchuria, an area of rugged mountains and woodlands and very lush river valleys, has become part of today's China only really in the last 400 years or so. We'll be talking about the Manchus, from which this territory now gets its name, Manchuria, later on in our lectures. The population of China itself has evolved in complex ways. The earliest people to call themselves Chinese, or to use a term to refer to themselves that we can see as referring to what we call the Chinese people. They call themselves the people of the black hair, lived on the North China Plain. And the earliest states, the earliest fairly complex political entities, emerged on the North China Plain as sort of as confederations of numerous tribal groups who defined themselves in contrast to people who were not Chinese, people who were not civilized, and who they saw as barbarians. And they used a number of terms which we translate into English as barbarians to refer to these other people. One of the key elements in this self-definition, in the way that they thought, in what it was that they thought made them civilized as opposed to the barbarians, was writing, the possession of a system of writing. The system of Chinese writing, of course, is very different. It's ideographic. It's based on the use of characters rather than an alphabet. And it seems to have emerged fairly quickly. We don't have a lot of transitional evidence about the emergence of writing. When it's there, it shows up as a fairly fully developed system. So we don't know a lot about its early stages of development, but at some point, about 3,500 years ago, there it is. And that's the time at which we can begin to see the Chinese people as a self-defined community, and this possession of a writing system to record their own history, to record their activities, is one of the key elements in that process. As Chinese civilization was expanding, neighboring peoples, particularly in the south, were either displaced or assimilated. That is to say, Chinese farmers who were moving largely south drove the indigenous populations either out or up, or intermarried with them and brought them into the community of Chinese civilization. When we talk about moving them out or up, some peoples in the south, when Chinese farmers began to come in and take over good land in the valleys, just packed up and left, just moved away. The people who today we call the Vietnamese people are an example of this. They formerly lived on the southeast coast of China, and as Chinese populations migrated south or moved south, these people traveled further down to where they live now in Southeast Asia. The Thai people that live in Thailand and Laos today had lived further inland in southern China. And again, as Chinese settlers filled up the river valleys, the people who today we call the Thai migrated off to the south and the west and settled eventually in their present territories. Other populations moved up out of the river valleys into marginal highland territories. And they have remained in place so that today, all across South China, there are non-Chinese ethnic communities living at higher elevations, living up in, what are generally called hill tribe communities. Many of these groups maintain their distinctive identities, they retain their own languages, they retain their own cultural practices, and today they constitute about 5% of the population of China as a whole. The vast majority of the Chinese people, the other 95%, are what we call the Han people. They derive that name from one of the great dynasties that we'll be talking about, the Han Dynasty. But about 54 officially recognized ethnic minorities, cultures which are not Chinese or not officially designated as Chinese, are scattered across the territory of China today. And most of these are in the south, and most of these are populations that had originally lived down in the agricultural lowlands, but which 2,000, 2,500 years or so ago were displaced to higher elevations. Well, let's return to the story of the emergence of Chinese civilization and its origins. Most of what we know about this process we know from archaeology. We know from the excavation of the material remains of people who occupied the territory that is today China, that have been dug up largely in the last 100 years. We know, for example, that ancestors, hominid ancestors of humans, lived in various parts of China more than 500,000 years ago. Very famous remains of Peking man found in caves located southwest of the modern-day capital of China were dug up back in the 1920s and 1930s, and these were dated to about 500 to 600,000 years ago. Similar fossils have been found in the far west of China and in southwest China, so that it's clear that there were very early ancestors of humans all around East Asia at this time. More recently, about 40,000 years ago, fossils of Homo sapiens, the present-day human species, begin to be found in China. And this is roughly the same time when we begin to see Homo sapiens in other parts of the world, suggesting that the expansion of modern human populations was fairly rapid, that the emergence of Homo sapiens took place all across the Eurasian landmass shortly after the first appearance of these people coming out of Africa. There's a series of stages of cultural development wherein more and more sophisticated stone tools are deployed, and stages of civilization are defined generally in terms of the tool complexes that are used. Now, about 10,000 years ago, about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 BC, a a very important set of developments takes place in central and southern China. And this has to do with the domestication of grains, in particular the domestication of rice. The earliest evidence of rice farming has been found in what is today Jiangxi province, which is south of the Yangtze River, and dates to about 12,000 BCE. That development, the domestication of grain, creates a situation, sets up the conditions for a dramatic transformation in the cultures in China, as indeed the domestication of grain does in other civilizations emerging in other parts of the world. Because the shift from a hunting and gathering culture, from a culture in which communities of people, tribes if we want to call them that, move around on a fairly constant basis, to one where the cultivation of a crop keeps them located in a particular place over time, leads to a number of transformations in culture. Okay? Probably the most significant that we see in China is the emergence of villages, the beginning of sedentary lifestyles, of a way of living where people remain in the same communities, remain in the same settlements, from not just from season to season, but from year to year and eventually from generation to generation. What we get, first in southern China and then in more elaborate developments in the north, are a series of cultures that begin to be identifiable, begin to have characteristics, begin to possess cultural traits that we can now link directly to historical Chinese civilization when it emerges. Okay? The Yellow River Valley becomes the focal point for several of these early civilizations. We can begin to identify these mostly through the pottery that they make. The beginning of the production of pottery, it really changes the way that we can look at cultures, the way that we can talk about communities of people, because suddenly we have very elaborate sets of artifacts that begin to be decorated, begin to be not merely functional objects, but seem to have some sort of aesthetic qualities along with them. And the communities that we begin to define, we can tell from the way that their pottery is made, and then from sort of the geographic distribution of their pottery, we can tell more of the history of specific groups. It becomes easier to identify specific groups and then to trace to some extent their interactions. In North China, there's two particular groups that emerge about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago that the archaeological record tells a very interesting story. In the west, about where the bend of the Yellow River turns to the north, there's a civilization or a culture that we call the Yangshao. And the Yangshao people settle in villages. The villages tend to be demarcated by ditches, by trenches, moats, if you will, that are probably defensive in function. Within the villages, people live in houses, in huts that are partially excavated. They're partially dug down into the soil, and then a superstructure is built up over that. There also appears to be some social differentiation, some hierarchy that starts to emerge within the Yangshao culture. We know from burials, from the excavation of graves, that some people were buried in a very elaborate fashion. They were buried with particularly higher quality grave goods. Nicer objects were put into the grave with them. And others were buried in more common graves. Some were placed in what may be ritually significant postures, while others were simply put into the ground sort of randomly. What's interesting in the Yangshao culture is that the individuals who are placed in the higher status graves are almost all women. And this suggests that at this time in Chinese history, that the societies that were emerging had a kind of leadership which was provided by women. Anthropology suggests that in a lot of emerging cultures, women play a role as spiritual leaders, that they are shamanesses, that they provide a link between the human community and the spirit world, and there are indications in the graves of the Yangshao culture that this is the case in China as well. Off to the east, in what is now Shandong province, at the lower end of the Yellow River, a different culture emerges, and this is called the Longshan. Longshan means Dragon Mountain, and it's named after a particular site where where objects associated with this culture are excavated. The Longshan culture has a pottery that's very different from the Yangshao culture. The Yangshao culture, pottery is fairly heavy, it tends to be sort of buff-colored. It's very elaborately decorated. Lots of images of fish and animals, eventually geometric designs on the surfaces. The Longshan pottery is very different. It's black. The surface is undecorated. The walls of the pots tend to be very thin, which indicates that the technology of production was somewhat more sophisticated than what the Yangshao culture had. What we see then in the record, in the archaeological record, is an interesting pattern, because the Longshan pots, which initially appear in a very specific area in East China, as time goes by, start to show up in archaeological sites that previously had been Yangshao culture. Eventually, the Longshan pottery spreads all over North China. And what this suggests is that a single culture comes to dominate the North China plain. Now, this is going on in a time frame that's between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. And this brings us down to a threshold where we can cross into recorded history, into the actual historical record of Chinese civilization. Further south, there's another set of developments that are taking place that are also linked to the eventual emergence of Chinese civilization, but which remain sort of separate tracks this early on. At the mouth of the Yangtze River, the area where the modern city of Shanghai is, and further upstream a bit, a different culture called the Liangzhu culture, also a culture with an elaborate pottery system, develops about this same time. And interestingly, it's in the Liangzhu culture that we actually have the first indications of a writing system in China. It's not a fully developed system, and indeed there are some scholars who question the links between the marks on Liangzhu pottery and the later Chinese writing system. But the general consensus is that these marks that are on various pots and other objects located in the Liangzhu area are ancestral to the written script that eventually emerges. What we think they are either markings of the craftsmen who produced the pots. They may have made little symbols that were meant to identify themselves, or perhaps identify the clan, the tribal group to which they belonged. Or they may have been marks of the owners of the pottery. That is to say, again, probably clan names, totems of some type or another that would give a sense of to whom, with whom these pots were associated. But this marking, this graphic identification system, seems to be the earliest form of a written language. It's, as I say, they're not long texts, they're just one or two characters or one or two symbols, but some of them appear in later inscriptions, and so it's felt that they are the earliest form of writing. Finally, in the southwest, in Sichuan, in the area bounded by the mountains and accessible only through the gorges, there's yet another area of early civilization, of early cultural emergence. This is the one about which still we know probably the least. There have been some interesting archaeological discoveries in recent years, but the Sichuan, the prehistory of Sichuan remains fairly murky. We do know that there were fairly large settlements. Some of these have been recently excavated, that there were independent ceramic traditions down there, forms of pottery that differed both in terms of their design and their decoration from any of the other three, the Yangshao, the Longshan, or the Liangzhu. Eventually, as we'll see in the next lecture, a bronze tradition emerges in Sichuan independently of the developments that take place in North China. It is indeed the emergence of bronze, the emergence of a metal-based culture as opposed to one primarily concerned with pottery and stone, that marks the transition archaeologically from prehistory into historical times. And we'll turn our attention to that in the next lecture.